Hey everyone, this is the HOPEcast from Hope Church RVA. I am Rachel Dawson and I'm on our communications team here at Hope. I'm joined today by our senior pastor, David Dwight. We are here to have a conversation about some common questions in life and faith in under 30 minutes. And today's question is, what do idols look like today? So David, the Bible talks a lot about idols. I don't think it's a word we super often hear a lot in our culture today. It can be a little unsure of what that even means, what that even looks like. I mean, if I'm off the top of my head, the only thing I can think of is American Idol is like the way that I've seen that word really used in our culture. So what, kind of give us a kind of frame or a little primer here. What are idols? What do they mean in the Bible? What do they mean for us today? And what do we kind of do with this idea of idols?
Well, in the Bible, idols are spoken of quite frequently, maybe more illustratively in the Old Testament than the New, but there are some provocative verses in the New Testament that talk about this. But in the Old Testament, where we begin to generally come upon the idea of idols is idols were physical things that people made, and they basically gave their devotion to them. So they sort of came in all shapes and sizes. So in the history of Israel, with the surrounding peoples that they had always lived their lives with, these surrounding peoples had different religious practices. And there are numerous gods of these surrounding people. So in the Old Testament, generally speaking, all of these people are generally lumped into a big category called the Canaanites. Okay, but the Canaanites had a whole bunch of different groups within them. So you have like the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hizzites, the Hittites, and so on. Okay, so maybe they were different tribes.
Okay.
It's almost a little bit like, say, Native American Indian tribes. On the one hand, the big category, you could say it's Native Americans. On the other hand, then you're going to have the Cherokee, the Sioux, and that kind of thing. So different tribes within this larger category. Okay, so these different groupings in the Old Testament had these different gods. Okay, so some of the names of these gods are, for instance, Baal, B-A-A-L, Ashereth or Ashtoreth is another one. These are Canaanite gods. Dagon, D-A-G-O-N is another one. Molech is another one. So these are these gods of these religious practices. And generally, these different people groups created some kind of a physical representation of these gods. Okay, so for instance, something you see frequently in the Old Testament is called Asherah poles. Okay. So again, I'm trying to give us things like that we could sort of attach these to. Most of us grew up, whether you thought they were cool or what, but somewhere along the line we learned like totem poles, Indian tribes had totem poles. Exactly where my brain went, So this pole is a kind of manifestation of this God idea. And people would come to this place. It almost created their sacred place or their shrine. People would come to this place, and that would become the place of worship. But generally, they would sort of prostrate themselves before this like Asherah pole. And then essentially it would look like they're worshiping this pole. In fact, the pole was their idol that was a representation of their God.
Interesting.
Okay. So that would be an idol, right? Pretty easy to like diagnose. Like it's a physical thing.
Right.
Standing there, right there.
Would there be one of them? Would everybody have their own?
That's the great next question. There were probably significant ones, and then probably people had their own smaller versions. Okay, so you might have a smaller version that was 10 inches high, and you put it on a shelf in your house, right? And so this was the way you kind of localized this experience.
Sure.
So you would have these different expressions of these foreign gods. Now, what these different cultures believed, that's a pretty deep, long theology lesson, but I think it's helpful for some Christians or people who are trying to understand the Bible. Some of the practices that these people undertook were just brutally evil. I mean, just brutally evil. And so somebody can read the Old Testament and read where God says to get rid of these people, and they're like, well, that sounds mean. If we understood anew what these religious practices were, we're talking child sacrifice, and we're talking dark, evil things. We're talking raping virgins and sacrificing them. It's this kind of stuff that God says, rid the earth of it. It is deeply, darkly evil. Okay, so it can help a little bit to understand some of that. And so you got these physical manifestations, these Asherah poles, these little figurines of these foreign gods, and so on. So those are idols. Okay, so God calls his people to have no idols. In other words, anytime you try to make some depiction or representation of me, you're going to reduce me from my fullness into something that you can manage and you can control.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is going to diminish God, and it's going to diminish us. So this is one reason he says to Israel, do not do this.
None.
Okay? But we're human beings, and we're all longing for like some tangible, touchable representation of God.
Yeah.
We do this all the time. In the Old Testament, it's pretty easy to see it because we generally do this in ways that create physical things. The most famous version in the Old Testament for Israel is when Moses is on the mountain with God, Mount Sinai, receiving the Ten Commandments. And when he comes back down, and Israel had built the golden calf, right? So they took all their jewelry, all their gold, everything, melted it down, and fashioned it in the form of a cow. And so this cow is made out of gold, and the people are worshiping it. So Israel had turned the God of Israel into a golden calf, and that was their representation of it. And they were worshiping it. You could say, why a calf and all that? Maybe because of the sacrificial system of sacrificing animals, so sacrificial bulls and so on. Anyway, this is one of Israel's lowest, worst moments. And Moses comes down from the mountain. He comes back to Israel. He's really upset about it.
Right.
Okay, so what are idols? They are things that they are ways that we fashion a god out of something. And in the Old Testament times, these were usually physical manifestations. In our day, there are tons of idols, but they're much, much, much more subtle. And this is where I think it becomes powerful and important to talk about. So, for instance, I mentioned this a bit in my sermon this past weekend. I think if we wanted to do what I'll call idol detectors, how do I know if something's an idol in my life? I'm not going to tell you directly if something's an idol in your life. First of all, if you're a person who recognizes a few things about idols, it's something we want to pay attention to. What do idols do? They will always reduce and diminish human beings. They will reduce us. They will reduce our dignity, and they will reduce the glory of God. All of those reductions are really bad reductions. They will reduce our dignity, reduce our identity, and reduce the glory of God. So let's use money as an easy example, okay? How do I know if money's an idol in my life? I'll use various words. I'm obsessed with it. I can't stop thinking about it. All my emotions are wrapped up in it. When my investments go up and down, my emotions go up and down. My identity is wrapped up in it. How much money do I have? What will people think of me based on my money? I've got to have more. I've got to have more in order to achieve what? The life that I think is important. That kind of thing would suggest to me that perhaps money has become an idol. So take that as one example. Now, what happens when an idol like this truly becomes an idol in our lives? We would never say this, but I think it is actually what's happening. You are embracing a mindset that is like this: money is me, and I am money. This reduction of who we are as human beings, made by God, loved by God, etc., is a really, really bad place to go.
Yeah.
Sex and sexuality is an idol in our day. So the degree to which we are wrapped up in it, our emotions are all in it, it's an untouchable topic. You can't talk about it. And that we insist on categorizing people through sex and sexuality. our sense of our life and our identity is about sex and sexuality, it's a reduction. And so here's where I think another thing about idols in the more subtle modern times is really important, is that when we allow that to happen, when we allow ourselves to say, basically, I am sex and sex is me, what's happened is there are so many things in life that God gives us as beautiful and good gifts. But when we distort them and make them an idol, the goodness of the gift becomes a curse. And something that God intends to be beautiful becomes a curse in our lives. So money is a gift. It's a vehicle. It's a thing that can help you in life. But if it becomes an idol, it will become a curse. You become obsessed with it. You have seen, probably I've seen money destroy families, destroy relationships. It means it's become an idol. So in the New Testament, some people will remember the account where this man who the Bible calls the rich young ruler came to Jesus. And he said, what do I need to do to enter the kingdom? I've obeyed the commandments. And Jesus reviews the commandments. And the guy's like, done all that. And then Jesus says to him, well, go sell all that you have, give the money to the poor, and then come follow me. And it says the man went away sad because he loved his wealth. Now, interestingly to me, does everybody who has money have to be confronted that way? I don't think so. I think Jesus confronted this guy because his money was his highest devotion. And when anything other than God is our highest devotion, it will diminish us. It will reduce our dignity and reduce us from the humanity that God intends for us. It will also turn a gift that God intends in our life into a curse. So sex is like this too. A beautiful gift of God designed in certain designs, but when we make it something that becomes a highest, it's likely to become a curse. And when we will define people by sex and sexuality, it's likely to become a curse. So the rich young ruler, like Jesus says, well, go get rid of your money, right? I think if sex has become a river that's overrun the banks in the culture in our lives, I think if a person in a similar vein came to Jesus and said, okay, so with regard to all this sex and sexuality, it's become a river that's overrun the banks. What should I do with it in my life? I think Jesus would say, be celibate and follow me. Now, the reason you know it's an idol is because the idol would rage at hearing that. You can't tell me to be celibate. This is me. This is who I am. This is my, and you'd say, this is your identity. You're saying this is my identity. Jesus would say, I will not stand by and have you reduce your identity as a human being to sex. And so a phrase that I used in my sermon on Sunday repeatedly was, he's never condemning, he's frequently confronting for the purpose of leading us to freedom and to life. I said it a few times in the earlier service, and I actually said it a lot more times in the 11 o'clock service. So he's never condemning, but he's frequently confronting. This is something that we human beings are like, I don't get that. Because if you confront me on something, to me, it feels like condemnation. It's not condemning. Jesus does this in ways that are breathtaking. It's not condemning, but it is confronting for the purpose of leading us to freedom and to life. So idols will diminish us, they'll reduce us. Tim Keller's phrase is, when a good thing becomes an ultimate thing in our lives, it's become an idol. Right? So here's how challenging it gets. Even a really good thing can become an idol. So your job can become an idol. You name it. The list is endless. And why are we, and I include myself in this, so susceptible to idols? I'm going to kind of go to some of what I mentioned on Sunday. I think our insecurities and our identity deficits. The places in our hearts that feel unfilled. The Bible says God created us with eternity in our hearts, a longing for eternity, which to me says we're wired to be filled by God. But if one way or another we're not feeling that that's happening with God, we'll try to fill that longing with something. So I say this very sympathetically. We're all human. We're all in this together. But the reason to try to identify idols in our lives and try to get them out or at least change their status, return it to being a gift from being a curse because it's gotten all my devotion. And then the categories of what could become an idol, I mean, anything could become an idol. Virtually anything, if it becomes an ultimate thing. If it becomes my highest devotion, it's probably become an idol. And while on the one hand, that strokes our fleshly emotions, in the long run, it reduces our humanity. And a gift turns into a curse. So in the New Testament, John, the writer of the Gospel John, is also the writer of the 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. When you read 1st John, it's like, I'll double check, but I think it's a 5-chapter letter. And so he's going at all this stuff about our life with God and what it is to live with God and transparently with him and everything. He's coming to the very end, and the very last sentence in the whole letter, "Dear children, keep yourselves from idols." It's like, what? Like you read it, it's like, hey, and by the way, my last word, keep yourselves from idols.
It's like a mic drop moment.
Exactly. And the hardship for us is I think we read that and we feel that it's punitive or condemning. It's not. It is to set us free from these reductions. So idols are much less clear, I think, in modern days.
Yeah, I think as you're describing some of that, I'm thinking, to think about the Old Testament version, right? You have this, I don't know, a gold calf statue in front of you. And I look at that, I'm like, of course that's not God. Like that's so small. You can hold it, you can grasp it, you can totally wrap your head around it. Of course, God is so much bigger and better. It's so clear in that analogy and that way of picturing it. And so much more unclear in our world today because, like you said, we wrap so much up into these things. They're not as concrete, they're not as tangible, and they're so interwoven in the ways that we define ourselves and all of those things. It's just, if I can remind myself to take that same, like, of course this calf is not God, thinking to like, of course, fill in the blank idol is not real freedom or real God or the best ultimate thing in my life. I need to be able to make that jump, and that's a hard thing to do.
I think that's right. And I think in our day, another category of idols would be things like social issues, our political allegiances and political viewpoints, politicians who we put on a pedestal and hold up. These are all examples of things that can become idols quickly. One of the things that I think is interesting, again, idols are not clear, so it's not easy to, let's use the phrase, diagnose them.
Yeah.
But if somebody's listening can embrace the MO that we're on here, which is, okay, but if I've got idols, I do want to be able to identify them and remove their idol status. I may or may not need to get it completely out of my life, but I do want to restore it to a gift, not a God. And so, interestingly, to me, this is an observation that I sense. In the last year, with a lot of political stuff in the air, I've seen a lot of people shape their religion underneath their politics. I would say that would make me want to ask if my politics have become an idol. Because if God is highest, I'm going to place my politics under my devotion to God. And in many ways in the last year or so, it doesn't seem that that's been the case. I think the more conspicuous and easier to identify versions of it, because of some of the inflamed things that happened in January 6th, are to point to people who were Trump followers. And I think that's a reasonable place to look. I do not think it's limited to people on the conservative side. I think our hearts do this on both sides of the spectrum. But when we see that we are placing our depth of relationship with God and our politics are becoming our main driving passion, that concerns me. And I don't think it goes to good places in the long run for societies. So trying to identify these things and right size them in our hearts, In the long run, if we want to find life, we're going to find them in this place where the God of the Bible, Jesus, the Trinitarian God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, are our highest. But the journey toward that, it's not simple. I'm not pretending it's easy.
Right.
This is part of a life of faith, and I think it's a rich invitation for us.
Yeah, I appreciate even the thought that to be an idol detector of our own hearts in a way, I think is helpful as I'm thinking of some practical next steps and like, wow, this conversation's been so rich. What do I do? In moving forward, right? Maybe I'm starting to feel like, oh, maybe that's an idol, or this thing feels like that's kind of on my mind. Do I need to look at that? I appreciate what you said about their idols or sometimes the things that are untouchable or untalk-aboutable in our lives.
Yeah.
And I also wonder if sometimes maybe they're the things we talk about a lot in our lives, right? If you're
Both
constantly coming, I don't know a great example, but you maybe talk about politics all the time and it's constantly on the top of your mind and it's in conversations and you're prone to sharing about it a lot online. All of these things, that also could be an idol. And I wonder,
Yes.
even in the ways that you're talking about, the ways we've linked our identity with some of these things, I think if you were to try to describe yourself, this feels like maybe a fun exercise of, hey, David, how would you describe yourself? I would think the words you would use, I'm a fill in the political party, or maybe if you have a different sexuality stance, people are so prone to I'm fill in the blank, and they use these things as their labels so often. I wonder if that's even a telltale sign of, hey, those might be some of the things to dig deeper in as idols in your life if you're so prone to link that thing with who you are.
That's really powerful. And to me, in a sense, I hope, basically, if someone said, David, who are you? I'd say I'm a child of God who's been redeemed by Jesus Christ. But I get it. We're living in a really complex world. I think another little thing that tends to happen with idols, again, it's another idol detector. It's not like an absolute, but it's a hint, or maybe more than a hint. Idols will protest at being exposed. When something's an idol, if it perhaps is getting light shed on it as being an idol, it will protest. Or worse, it will rage, or bully, or try to silence you, or try to shut you up, or basically say, you cannot expose me that way. Idols generally will protest. And this phrase, like in family life, is there something that is an untouchable topic? It'd be good to ask if that's an idol. And again, the subtlety of idols, even our pain can become an idol. We can decide that we are making our pain our highest identity. And ironically, it then becomes our highest devotion.
Yeah.
And it becomes an idol. And everybody would say, well, who in the world would make their pain an idol? We do it. Our grief, our losses, the injustices. And this is almost back to that whole New Testament picture of having this persevering, hopeful view of life in Christ, even in the midst of our pain.
That's good. I feel like as we come to a close here, man, I'm just thinking a lot about being aware and willing to take a look at these things. And like you said, they're not as clear, but it's going to take a little bit, maybe more of a magnifying glass, maybe some accountability, some friends in my life, a willingness to engage with scripture and be kind of sharpened and refined by what the Lord is saying to me through it. Being in community of people who can call out blind spots in my life or help me see things. I'm just mindful that, man, it's a hard journey and some good work to be done in those spaces.
Yeah. And if we can do this with trust, like I mentioned, and somebody told me they were surprised at the vulnerability of it. I mentioned in my sermon last Sunday, in some meaningful conversations I've had with my wife, Elizabeth, she said to me, do you think it's possible that Hope Church is an idol for you? She wasn't being condemning. And I said, you know what? I don't know that I've ever cast it in that light. That's a really helpful question for me. And it's a really good place for me to give real consideration and prayer. So to me, that's freeing. And I really said to her, thank you for raising that question. It really helps me. But this journey to try to give our hearts to the one God who truly gives us life and doesn't diminish us, that's the journey that Jesus is inviting us on.
That's good. I appreciate you leading with vulnerability in that way. As you shared that, I I felt like, man, if even the pastor of a church who's devoted so much of your life to this place and this ministry for so many years is willing to look at things honestly and be willing to engage the Lord in those conversations through prayer, I think is really powerful. So I appreciate you saying that. All right. Well, thank you all for listening with us today as we've just tackled the question of idols. We invite you to subscribe to the HOPEcast in your favorite podcast app, wherever that is, or check it out on our website, hopechurchrva.com. You can find all past episodes and more about the work that we are doing in Richmond and beyond. So thank you all for listening, and we'll hope you'll tune in next time.
Take care, everybody.